I don't know about you, but I love me a good allegory. You know what an allegory is, right? It's one of those very interesting story forms we have. It's similar to some other kinds of stories. There's a variety of these. There are what we call fables, and fables tell a moral story, but fables always do it by using animals. And so you probably know like Aesop's fables. You got the story of the tortoise and the hare, and we all know that slow and steady wins the race, right? Or Peter Rabbit, little Peter that doesn't obey his mother and gets himself in all kinds of trouble because he wasn't listening to what his mother told him to do. Those are fables. And then you've got parables. Now, parables use people, and parables are symbolic in how they're told. Jesus loved parables. Parables are usually pretty short. If you read the parables that Jesus told, they're not real long stories. They have one primary point to them. Jesus told stories like the servant who was entrusted with some of his master's money to invest it. And in fear and in laziness, he went and buried the little bit of money he'd been entrusted with, whereas his other servants went out and invested. And the moral of the story was that that servant was called to account. He actually faced judgment for his laziness in failing to use what he'd been given. Or the story of the prodigal son, who went off to a far country, took his inheritance early, went out, squandered it, wasted it on terrible living, and came home expecting to face his father's wrath, and instead was met with grace and was restored. Or the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember the Good Samaritan who goes on a business trip. Well, actually, not the Good Samaritan, but a man goes on a business trip, and he falls into the hands of thieves and robbers. They rob him, they beat him, they leave him to die in a ditch. And some religious leaders come by, and they'll have nothing to do with him. They won't touch him because he's unclean. And yet it is a Samaritan who was a very hated part of a hated racial group by the Jews, but it is in fact a Samaritan in Jesus' story that is the one who stops to help the man, puts him on his own donkey, takes him to an inn, pays for his care, and Jesus is making this story about, making the point of who is my neighbor, and that sometimes the neighbor is the most unlikely of people. Now, allegories are kind of like parables. They're a step up from that. An allegory usually is a much longer story, and the characters in the story all carry lots of symbolism in them. We have a number of examples of allegories from literature outside of the Bible. Maybe one of the most famous in Christian literature, it was Paul Bunyan's work, Pilgrim's Progress. If you've ever read Pilgrim's Progress, you'll know that it's populated with all of these characters that have very interesting names. Like Pilgrim, who is the hero of the story. This is the story about his journey through the spiritual life. Some of his neighbors, before he sets out on his journey, have names like Obstinate and Pliable. And so that's his next door neighbor, Obstinate. I actually lived next to that guy one time. And then there's some interesting landmarks as you go through the story. There is the Slough of Despond. Wow, is that descriptive? You know, the swamp of despair, you might say. Or there is Vanity Fair, where Pilgrim is tempted to stop and spend his time, spend his life pursuing just the pleasures of the world in Vanity Fair. C.S. Lewis, of course, wrote several wonderful allegories, the best known being the Chronicles of Narnia. And the Chronicles of Narnia, you have a mix of both animals and people that all carry just a deep symbolism as to what they're saying about the spiritual life. He wrote some others. He wrote one that was a takeoff on A Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's. He wrote one called The Pilgrim's Regress. And if you ever want to read that, be sure you read the footnotes. It's really a look at all the world philosophies and set in the form of different characters in his story. Today, we're going to take a look at an allegory. It's actually not a true allegory, because a true allegory would be a fictional story that has been created by the author with specific hidden meanings in mind. When Paul Bunyan wrote his Pilgrim's Progress, he thought through the whole story, and he constructed that fictional story because there were specific things he wanted to communicate through his characters. This, rather, is an allegorical interpretation. What that does is it takes a pre-existing story. It could be a fictional story. It could be a true historical story. And then it takes that story and it overlays onto it some hidden meanings. It pulls things out of the story that weren't really there to begin with. Allegories can be really helpful. Allegories have this way of taking really big, hard to grasp ideas and putting them into a tangible storyline that helps us to remember and understand and even better apply the point of the story. I think allegories often give us a fresh perspective and help us to see things more clearly. And for certain learning styles, allegories can be the spark that really ignites understanding. Some of us really relate to stories in that way, and to read an allegory just communicates so much. Allegories can also create problems, because when you take a big idea and then you try to creatively express it through a small story, it is possible for the storyline to end up distorting the big idea. The story actually takes over the idea and begins to morph what the big idea originally was. And among ancient Christian writers, people like Augustine, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, others, allegorical interpretation was a very popular way of trying to understand the Bible. And what they would do would take any passage and then they would begin to discover all kinds of hidden meanings within that passage. And some of the meanings they discovered ended up being, I'd have to say, more creative and far-fetched than they really were insightful or real. Let me just give you one example. I talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. There are some important elements to the story that I just want to bring out. Here's a couple allegories for us. Let's move on past that. All right, so here is some elements of the Good Samaritan and allegorical interpretation. Okay, so we had the traveler that went on his journey, and he gets robbed, and then this Samaritan comes along, rescues him, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an innkeeper, puts him in an inn, says he'll pay for whatever it takes to care for this guy, nurse him back to health. Okay, that's the story. Now, Augustine loved allegorical interpretation. Origen did as well. And they both took this parable and began to see hidden truths in it. So here's what happens when you start discovering hidden truths in the story. They said, well, the traveler, that really is Adam. Okay, and he's on his journey through the world. And the robbers, well, that's really the devil and his demons who are attacking us as we go through the world. Now, the Samaritan, that was really Jesus, and the donkey was actually Jesus' body, because you see, Jesus bore our wounds on himself, and so the donkey carried the wounded traveler. That was Jesus' body. The inn, well, that's the church, and the apostles, as the founders of the church, they are the innkeepers. And they finally get down to the promise to pay, and I guess struggling to somehow keep the apostles as the innkeeper, the best they came up with was that Paul apparently had a vow of celibacy, and that somehow equaled the promise to pay the innkeeper, if you can follow that. I can't really follow that. Allegorical interpretations are still popular with some teachers, and there's a place for it. I'm not against seeing allegorical interpretations, but I think you have to be wise. The first thing you have to do is make sure you understand what the Bible plainly is saying. Before you start trying to look for hidden meanings, be sure you know what it's actually saying right up front and obvious. The second is that if the story obviously is a parable, like the Good Samaritan, look for the most obvious lesson. Look at the context. What gave rise to the story? If you read this story, you'll find that Jesus was being challenged by a religious leader to define who your neighbor is. If you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, well, the question is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus then tells this story, and he makes the hero of the story a Samaritan who was very despised by the religious leaders. He makes him the hero who saves a stranger that he doesn't even know. And Jesus says, there's the answer to your question. Who is my neighbor? That's the most obvious thing that's going on. Third, if the contours of the story do provide parallels that help to illustrate another truth, that's great. Enjoy the things that you may see, the connections that you may make, but just remember that the parallel thoughts that something may spark in your own mind or may have sparked in someone else's mind don't redefine what the story originally meant. Okay? Don't say that what Jesus really meant was that he told this story to talk about Paul's vow of celibacy, because that's not why Jesus told the story. That would be a misunderstanding. Okay, well, with that little bit of English literature under our belt, you're going to say, Tim, why are you talking about this? I think you'll understand as we get into the passage today. We're going to take a look at Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. Here's how it reads. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. See, there's a reason I talked about that. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor, for the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. What? Did you follow any of that? Okay, let me give you some context. Quick review. I've said this before, but you got to understand why Paul is writing this letter to the people in the province of Galatia. He writes this to people who are relatively new followers of Jesus. These are small churches that he had helped to start in the Roman province of Galatia, and the members of these churches are racially and culturally diverse, now living in a common community of faith and love empowered by God's Spirit, something that was very unique in their communities. However, tension has re-entered the picture because there are some new teachers. These new teachers, apparently Jewish teachers who have come down from Jerusalem, they've shown up and they've told them that Paul hasn't really given them the whole message. They're telling them that if the Galatians want to be true Jesus followers, if they want to really do this religion thing right, that they need to conform their lifestyles. And specifically, that to love Jesus means that they need to also follow all of the ritual rules of the Old Testament. Like any good Orthodox Jew would, they're telling them you need to follow those rules just as well. And they're telling them that includes things like the rite of circumcision, and it includes dietary laws, and it includes the observance of the right holidays and doing it in the right ways, and the list goes on. And Paul, having heard about this, is shocked to find out that these teachings are actually getting traction, that the people are listening to it, and what he sees it doing is doing damage to the community. And that they are embracing what is really a false message about what Christ has done. And so he writes this letter to refute these teachers and to remind the Galatians that their relationship with God is based on his grace, not their self-effort. Now, he's argued this in several ways already. And in this passage, he is going to retell a well-known Old Testament story, but he's going to give it an allegorical twist. Let me make an aside here. If you've been tracking this series, you realize that we've been kind of hitting on the same theme repeatedly for several weeks in a row. And that's because that's what Paul does. He keeps hitting on the same thing here. Just in case you're wondering, are we ever going to talk about something else? Yes, we do. There are some things coming up in the weeks ahead that Paul begins to encounter some other issues, and really they're issues related to this, but I just want you to know that this will not be the only thing we talk about. The story that he is going to make his allegory about is actually a fairly long story if you went back and read it originally. You'd have to read from Genesis chapter 12 all the way up to Genesis chapter 21 if you want to read the full context of this story about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Ishmael and Hagar. It covers about 25 years that this particular piece of the story is unfolding. And it begins with a promise that God made to Abraham. The promise is that God was going to bless him, and he was going to bring from him a great nation, that he would in fact create a family tree that would number into the millions, which was quite a promise, especially to a guy like Abraham, because at the time, Abraham was an old man, and his wife, Sarah, was also an old woman. And despite the fact they had been married for many years and had always wanted children, they had never been able to conceive. Well, as the story unfolds, we see that Abraham and Sarah are eager to claim the promise, this promise that God's going to create a great nation. But they're also realistic enough to know that their prospects are slim to nil that that's going to happen. And so Sarah comes up with a reasonable plan to help God out. She suggests that her Egyptian servant girl, Hagar, step into her place and act as a surrogate mother. In the day before there were fertility treatment clinics, this was a pretty accepted way to make up for being childless. You could have a child through a servant and treat it as the full heir. Well, Abraham concurs, and Sarah, or Hagar, bears him a son. That son is Ishmael. Whew. Thanks to Sarah's quick thinking, God's promise has been rescued from certain failure. You ever get caught up doing that, trying to help God out? Well, it seems to go well for about the next 14 years. They're feeling good. They're on the right track. They can see the way that this is going to work out. Ishmael grows up to be a healthy young boy. Abraham loves him dearly. But there are some problems that begin to crop up. Hagar recognizes that she has been able to do something for Abraham that Sarah could not do. And there's some pride. And in a culture and a time when bearing children was a tremendous mark of significance for a woman, Hagar begins to see herself as somewhat superior to her mistress. And so tension comes into the family. The other little problem is that Abraham's fallback plan was never God's promised plan. And God tells Abraham that Ishmael isn't what or who he had promised. That in fact he is going to bless Abraham with a son, but he's going to do that through Sarah. And that's a promise that literally makes Sarah laugh when she hears it, because it seems so ridiculous. Abraham himself even tries to tell God that he doesn't really need to bother because he's perfectly happy with his alternate son plan. Ishmael's a good boy. This is going to work out fine. Well, Sarah and Abraham are laughing again a few months later when she gives birth to a son, Isaac. In fact, Isaac's name means laughter. Who would have thought that this could ever happen? But then tension resurfaces because now the question is, which of these sons is going to receive the benefits and fill the role of the firstborn, which was a very significant role in their culture? Will it be the firstborn of Hagar, Ishmael, or will it be the firstborn of Sarah, Abraham's wife? Will it be Isaac? And in the end, Sarah demands that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. Okay, there's lots more to that story. But that will give us the big pieces that we need to understand this allegory that Paul wants to tell. Galatians 4:21 and 22. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it's written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. Paul is going to try to use the law to defeat the law. And what he's doing is he's using this word law in 2 different senses. When he talks about you who want to be under the law, he's talking about the ritual and the rites that were being pushed on these people. Things like circumcision and dietary laws and all of that. But then he says, do you not listen to the law? And what he's talking about here is a bigger context, not just the codified part of conduct, but the larger story that gave rise to that code being given. What we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those books were called the law. And they really tell the story ranging all the way from creation through Israel's escape from Egypt up to their coming to Mount Sinai in the wilderness and God giving them the code, the law. And so he says, you people want to live under the code. Have you not read the bigger story of the law? And then he gives them the story in a nutshell. He says, Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. So now he's laying out some key pieces of the story. We find that there are 2 women in this story. And then we also have 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And they come from 2 different classes. One of them is free, one of them is a slave. And they are born 2 different methods. One natural, like you would expect. One supernatural, by a woman who should not have been able to bear children. And so Paul says, now this may be interpreted allegorically. 2 women, 2 covenants. The slave woman, Hagar. Paul makes 2 connections to Hagar. The first is, Hagar is a slave. She was the first woman to bear a child, but she is equated to being the first covenant, the law that was given to Israel. But nevertheless, she still is a slave, and her child and his children live under that label in relation to Abraham. They continue to live as slaves. So that's one connection he wants them to have firmly in mind, that this is the slave. The second one, he says, now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. Now, this is one of the problems with analogy and allegory. It's not always flattering. Hagar is a mountain. That's probably not real flattering. I have had trouble over the years with enjoying analogies, and sometimes having analogies get away from me. At one point, years ago, before we were married, Brenda and I were talking about something, and I forget what was happening. She was following me and doing something, and I somehow made the analogy that she was like a trailer. Okay, gentlemen, just so you know, comparing your wife to a trailer really isn't a great idea. I'm not sure how often Paul compared women to mountains. This could explain why he appears never to have married, because some things just ought not to be done. But I think the reason Paul adds Mount Sinai in Arabia into this is, he's mixing metaphors. Mount Sinai is where the law was given, and so it stands as a symbol of the law. That's where Israel had come to when Moses went up, received the 10 Commandments, received the rest of the law. Sinai was not in the promised land. I think that this is the important part of it. They were on their way to the promised land. They'd escaped from Egypt. They're on their way. They come to Mount Sinai, but Mount Sinai is not in the promised land. They are still in this gray zone between having been enslaved to the Egyptians, but not yet really free in their own land of promise. And Mount Sinai, while it was a major landmark, it was a fixed place. it would never be in the promised land. It was a mountain and it was stuck where it was at. So I think Paul is saying that not only does living under the law mean living enslaved as the child of a slave, Hagar being the slave, it also means being chained to something that will never let you fully enter into God's promised freedom. Right? Hagar is a slave, and Hagar is a mountain who can never come into the land of promise. Shockingly, he then equates Jerusalem with Mount Sinai. Now, that was a big deal because Jerusalem was the treasured flagship city of the promised land. I mean, if you want to know that you are in the land of promise, put yourself in Jerusalem. That's where the palace is. That's where the temple is. That shows the fulfillment of all that God had promised to bring the people into freedom, into their own land. For the Jews to live in Jerusalem was to inhabit the earthly crown jewel of the ancient promise that God had made to Abraham. And yet in his story, Paul suddenly takes the crown jewel, or if you will, the flagship, and metaphorically sails it back across the Jordan and out into the no man's land of the wilderness, and says Jerusalem really isn't located in the promised land. Jerusalem actually is stuck out there at Mount Sinai. Perhaps he's intentionally doing this because the false teachers who were trying to sway these people apparently had come from Jerusalem. And so he, in part, is probably trying to say, these people are trying to tell you that they are the way forward. I'm telling you they are the way backwards. Paul says if you take your cues from there, you're really walking yourself right back out of God's promised freedom all the way back to Mount Sinai. So, if Hagar is Mount Sinai, and if Jerusalem is also Mount Sinai in his allegory, then it's probably fair to say that Hagar equals Jerusalem, which equals slavery. If you're going to buy into the Jerusalem system, Paul is saying, you are really bringing yourself back under slavery. But there is another mother. Galatians 4:26, he says, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. If Hagar is your mama, then you're a slave. But there is another mother, and she is free. It's interesting that Paul never uses Sarah's name. He always just refers to her as the free woman. 4 times he talks about her as being free, the free woman. And he says this free woman, if you want to equate her to a city, she would be a new Jerusalem. A new Jerusalem at a new altitude, the Jerusalem above, which has no connection to Mount Sinai. In fact, I think the image is the Jerusalem above is above Mount Sinai. This is something higher that we've been called to, and it is free, like the free woman. And we who follow Jesus in faith are her children. And so he wraps it up this way. He says, so brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Okay, so where's Paul going to go with this rather complicated story? Well, he makes a few applications. First, he says, now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. You see, Hagar had some natural ability that Sarah lacked, and it made her proud. And she began to abuse Sarah because of that. You know, it's funny that sometimes good folks from good homes with good manners can easily get their emphasis on the wrong syllable when it comes to what matters with God. When I was young, we attended a small church for a while that was very prim and proper. And one Sunday, I happened to overhear this conversation. A young mom had come and she brought her little girl. The little girl was probably 5, maybe 6 years old. And after the service was over, one of the older ladies in the church approached this little girl. She shook her hand and she said, you know, it's wonderful that you came And we'll look forward to seeing you here next time, but I know that next time you won't wear such a short skirt. I bet that little girl formed an impression that day of what it takes to be truly loved by God. You know what it takes to be truly loved by God? 2 inches of fabric. That's what God really cares about. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't care about modesty. God does care about modesty. But sometimes we can get so preoccupied with the externals, with how people look, with what they do, their behavior, that we miss looking at something deeper, which is the heart. I don't know what that little girl's background was. I don't know if she'd ever been in church before. I don't know if she had a faith in Jesus. But that lady didn't either. And that would have been the really good thing to find out first, is who is this person? Because what God loves, what Jesus died for, wasn't her him. He died for her heart. And when the heart is right, the him may change. But first, what matters most in God's eyes? See, simply enforcing codes and rituals may get the appearance that you want, but they can also manufacture shallowness and hypocrisy. And Paul knew that only too well. He knew from his own background that there were a lot of people that looked really good. They did all the right things, and yet there was deep hypocrisy. The people that were the most devout in professing their faith and showing it off were the very same people who plotted together about how to murder an innocent man, Jesus, and didn't find any conflict in their consciences between those two things because they looked like they were doing all the right things, even though their hearts were in completely the wrong place. But Paul knows that as long as those people are around, like Hagar, they will become critical of the people that don't look right, that don't do it right, that don't sound right. And his response is Galatians 4:30. What does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. Now again, if you read the story, you'll know that what Sarah did here in throwing Hagar out, it was not a high point in Sarah's career. But Paul isn't trying to relate all the fine points of the story. He's picking up on this idea that for the way I'm using this story and this allegory, these people that are trying to put you back under bondage, that are criticizing you and are pressuring you and trying to control you, he says, your right response to that really should be the same thing that happened between Sarah and Hagar, which at some point in the tension, Sarah finally said, enough, you're out of here. He says, you need to take these false teachers and you need to get rid of the empty ritual and get rid of the influence that are telling you that this is the way you're supposed to try and earn God's favor. Religiosity is not your inheritance. He wants them to remember that they did not come into God's family the way people normally try to get into God's family. You realize that working hard and looking right is what almost every religion requires? If you want God to accept you, you need to do your deeds. You need to record your hours. You need to pay your alms and say your prayers and make your sacrifices, and if you do it all right, then maybe God will accept you. But Paul has told them that they have been invited in by a door that no one ever expected to see open to them. They have been invited in by the door of grace. And grace is not based on my merit, but it's based on God's great kindness. There's a song that we have sung a few times, and I know it has bugged some of you. The lyrics talk about the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And it's that one word that causes a lot of debate sometimes. Can we ever talk about God's love as being reckless? But what the songwriter is trying to do is he's trying to capture how grace looks to a legalist. That's how grace looks to a legalist. What do you mean you're giving grace to this person? What do you mean you love someone who's done things like that? That is absolutely reckless. That's how these teachers were that had come in behind Paul. They're saying, hey, all this talk about grace and God's love and forgiveness and all. People, it's not that simple. You got some work to do here. You got to toe the line. God's not reckless about who he lets into heaven, okay? Now, Jesus told the story about the prodigal son. Remember the older brother? What did he think? Father, you're being pretty reckless if you're going to let this kid back in the house and restore him to full benefits because he's wasted what you gave him. From a legalist point of view, grace looks pretty reckless. Poured out on the wrong people and people who haven't earned it and don't deserve it. So the question is, can you find yourself in this story? You want what it is that God has for you, but the Isaac way sounds too good to be true. The Ishmael way, it just makes sense. Maybe you're a bit like Abraham, that after Ishmael was born and God told him that he had something more to give him, Abraham's initial response was, that's okay, I've got this worked out. I've got a plan. I'm going to be fine with my plan. I really think that I've come up with something that's going to do the trick. It'll accomplish what you want, God. And maybe you're working really hard at being a good person. But you really haven't yet learned how much God loves you, with or without your efforts. And in fact, some of the things in your life that you're hoping God doesn't find out about, I got news for you. He knows. Which makes grace a wonderful thing because he still wants to invite you in. Maybe you're the person who thinks that all these church people look good, but down in your heart, you're thinking, I'll never be one of them. I just don't have what it takes. I've lived too far on the other side of the tracks, and these people would be horrified if they knew that somebody like me had snuck in here on a Sunday morning. I've got stuff in my closet. I've got stuff that no good Christian should have. You see, the normal way that people come at religion is the Ishmael way. We try really hard to figure out a system to overcome our shortcomings. We try to clean up our act, we get hold of a good rule book, or maybe we write our own, and we try to look like decent folks. But if you're simply keeping rules, obeying orders, Paul would say that's the way slaves live. The Jesus way is the Isaac way. And it is really different. To show how different it is, Paul sticks with this image of mothers and birth, and he quotes a poem of paradox, one that was written about 600 years earlier by the prophet Isaiah. You could go back and look at Isaiah 54 if you want to see it in context. But Isaiah was writing to the people of Israel while they were in exile. They were in a place of slavery living in Babylon. They found themselves in that place 1,200 years after the original promise was made to Abraham. And it seemed in that time, in that place, like they were finished as a nation. In fact, the reason they were there was because they had failed to keep God's law. They had faced judgment. They were living in punishment, and the nations around them seemed strong, and yet they, as a nation, were weak, they were failed, they were broken, and they felt hopeless. And Isaiah, speaking to these broken and hopeless people, uses the poetic imagery of an unmarried and unwanted and barren woman. As I said earlier, in those ancient days, a woman's value was almost entirely wrapped up in her ability to bear children. To be childless meant that the family line was at an end. For the Israelites, it meant the loss of their treasured inheritance in the promised land, because once they got in the promised land, it was broken up by families, passed down, father to son, father to son. If there were no sons, the inheritance would be lost. Personally, it meant going into old age with no one to care for you. There wasn't Social Security. You didn't have a 401k. You had your kids, and if you didn't have any kids, who was there to care for you? To not have children was seen as weakness and failure, maybe even God's judgment. For the woman, it often meant being unloved and even cast aside by her husband, swapped out for a younger model, like Sarah traded for Hagar. And to people who carried those kinds of bleak thoughts in their hearts, Isaiah sang this song. Look at the words. Paul quoting it. "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband." Isaiah predicts that these people are going to be like a woman who has been told that she cannot bear children, suddenly hosting her own baby shower. He says that without even going into labor, her cries of joy are going to raise the roof on the maternity ward. All gain, no pain. He says that this single woman who has no family and no prospects is going to suddenly find herself driving a minivan filled with booster seats. He says a miracle is going to happen. That's crazy talk. But I've heard this story related over and over again by people. People who talk about a point in their lives where there was this deep emptiness inside. And for many of them, it didn't make any sense because they had lots of stuff. They had good stuff. They had accomplished their dreams. They were working hard on their issues and feeling like they were making good progress. And yet, that empty thing was still in there. Or for some people, the empty makes a lot of sense because by their own standards and everybody else's, they have failed. And the tough spot that they're in is the result of their own foolish choices. And the road ahead looks like a dead end. The message of Jesus is that he did the deep thing for us that we could not do for ourselves. It's a deep thing that mysteriously fits and fills the empty place inside. On the cross, in this profound, mysterious, miraculous way, God's Son took the ugliness and the emptiness of the world into himself, and he crushed it. And when he rose from the dead, it was a victory dance. In him, ugliness and emptiness are defeated. And I can't fully explain that any more than you can explain the ugly and the empty that you feel inside. But I can tell you that men and women, ever since, in a simple act of desperate faith, have asked Jesus to forgive their ugliness and to fill their emptiness, and he has. That spiritual freedom can be described in all kinds of ways. Some, like Paul, mix their metaphors from old Bible stories, and they describe God's gift being like an infertile woman who suddenly is holding her own newborn, or as being an honored citizen in the capital city of God when you knew that you were an outcast that deserved the Badlands. Others, like the derelict slave trader John Newton, describe God's grace poetically. Newton says, "I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see." Some express it like a crusty old guy who came to Jesus late in life, and he told me once with heartfelt honesty, he said, "It's the best damn thing I ever did." Those are shocking words to the ears of a legalist. But I think they are music to the heart of God, who delights in seeing crusty old codgers discover his love. If you're that person who knows God's grace is for you, but you've slipped into thinking that the real reason he loves you or doesn't love you so much is because you have or haven't done enough, let me remind you of Paul's words. says, we are not children of the slave, but of the free. If you're the person that feels ugly or empty inside and this grace offer just sounds too good to be true, you keep thinking, this couldn't be for me. Maybe it's an age thing. You're thinking, I'm too old to cash in on an offer like that. God would want more bang for his buck than I've got left in the barrel. It's for you. Any age, any stage. It was while hanging on the cross that Jesus himself offered forgiveness and life to a convicted criminal who was being crucified next to him. That guy didn't have a lot of time left to do anything for God. He was at the end. And yet, in the middle of an execution, Jesus offered him life. One of the highlights of my ministry has been the Sunday that we baptized Harry Simpson at age 93. And I saw the light in his eyes because Harry knew that it was for him. The offer of grace really is for you. We've got the choices, but the Ishmael way is a dead end. It really is a gift. Faith is the path. It really is that free. It really is that good. Amen?